But welcome everybody, those of you I know and those of you that I don't. I'm Thomas Arnold. I am in the Boston area. I work in kind of what used to be called robot ethics. I think it's a little bit of an obsolete term, but I work in the computer science department at Tufts University. But my background, as I was telling our guest today, is in religious studies. So I am very excited to have Dr. Robin Hanson with us today, who teaches economics, professor of economics at George Mason University, and as you might guess, has a fairly refreshing view of thinking about the sacred, coming from that discipline and coming from the many issues that Robin has written upon in policy, leadership, innovation, technology. So I was thrilled to be invited to host this salon today, and I think we have a nice, engaged, nicely sized group to ask questions. So please put questions that you have in the chat, and I think we should all be able to ask them directly as well as time goes on. So yes, let's dive in. I hope that you got a chance to at least look at Robin's piece that was linked in the announcement. It's part of uh, a number of blog posts and articles and pieces that he has been working on, kind of looking at doing more of an empirical look at what categories and dynamics are at work with the sacred. So I thought I would open up. I was really intrigued by the opening of the piece and what motivates this study of the sacred. There are plenty of motivations that have animated people coming into explaining something like the sacred. So, Robin, if you could kind of give us some of that angle, that would be great.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all. And hopefully this is the beginning of a long, like thinking of the end of famous movie, it's the beginning of a beautiful friendship here, right? Right, to be having a relationship from this point on. So first of all, I have to acknowledge what it seems strange to me and must seem strange to you, that I would be talking about the sacred. That is, in my world of economics, it's just not a topic that ever comes up. Nobody ever thinks about it. And it's not even, seen as in their world, really, and not worth considering. And then it's a familiar concept to everyone. And then it feels like that so many people must have talked about it for so long, because it's such a big concept in the world, that surely you would want to hear an expert who has spent years thinking about that, talking about it. And it would be odd that I, as someone who spent most of my life completely ignoring the topic, would suddenly not only talk about it, but think he had something original to say and something new to listen to, right? So that's just got to seem odd right from the start. And I acknowledge that. Okay, so here's where I came from. I mean, first of all, I'm somewhat of a polymath. So I've spent my career looking for neglected topics and looking for ways to, connect things, where you look for tools or insights in one area and that they could apply to somewhere else that people haven't noticed. So I'm on the lookout for, ways to add. And I've had a career of sort of learning lots of different tools and lots of different ways of thinking and lots of different data. And so I think that sort of gives me a squared effect that is, my productivity increases with all the different things I've learned over my lifetime. And so I have more and more ability to notice connections and to find ways to apply one thing to another. And so even if my physical productivity is declining, my overall intellectual productivity should be increasing because of this polymath effect of, and this I think is an example of that, and a somewhat successful one, but you'll have to judge, of being a polymath. But still there's the question, but why pick this thing and why think I have anything interesting to say? So that the starting point is that as an economist, we not only study the way the world is, we think about the way the world could be, and we use our best theories of explaining what things are to suggest changes to the world. And often we make relatively small suggestions, which are more easy to take up, but sometimes we think about bigger suggestions, bigger ways to change the world. And I've been especially interested in big ways to change the world. and collected a lot of big ideas for change. And then when we make a big idea for change, of course, we combine it with some analysis of why it would make sense, why it would be an improvement over the previous way we do things. And then when we present that to the world, we often get responses of, well, just oblivious, sort of like, why would you even do that? What's the point of thinking about things different? Surely you couldn't possibly think we know enough to make any substantial changes. But then there's this sort of reaction that says, yeah, nobody's going to consider those sorts of changes. No way is anybody going to let you make any changes that big. And you go, well, of course, we're going to start small and work our way up. We don't mean to change things all at once. And people say, no, that's not what we mean. We like these things are just out of the Overton window. They're just off the table. They're just not allowed to be changed. You say, but why not? Why can't we change some things? And then, we go around and around, and basically people come out saying, well, there's stuff that's sacred, and you're messing with the sacred. You're just messing with stuff that shouldn't be touched, and nobody thinks anybody should touch it because it's sacred, even if it's like not obvious why it's the best. It's just you're messing with it. And I got that response often enough. And of course, what we try to do is we say, no, we're not messing with the sacred. You could leave all your sacred things alone and this would be different and things would be fine. And people, no, you don't get it. You're not supposed to mess with these important things. Like, for example, medicine. People say, you can't have a different institution for medicine. You can't buy medicine differently because medicine is sacred and you shouldn't mess with it, right? Or schools. Shouldn't mess with schools. Schools are sacred. And so I just got to the point where I said, this has been in my way for a long time. It's like the pebble in your shoe. After a while, you go, I'm going to stop and take off my shoe and try to find this pebble and get it out of there, right? So I turned to the sacred and I said, I should by now be able to study this thing. Let's go figure this thing out. Why is this thing in my way? And, can I figure out whether it should be in my way? Is there a way to get it out of my way? Is it in my way for a good reason? Let's figure this thing out. That was my motive.
Yeah, I think it's such a refreshing one because of how so many 19th, 20th century theories around the sacred were kind of bound up with what is going on with these strange people, and we need to be able to govern them or do something with them. And you can see the kind of marks of that on both the theories of it and some of the critiques and reactions, which in some ways kind of go in the opposite direction of that pebble is never coming out of your shoe. You're never going to be able to explain it. You're never going to be able to dislodge it. So stop trying. And I think that's what's interesting about your attempt, is that you're both doing kind of an empirical survey, and you've got these two theoretical kind of pillars, I guess. One of them you're getting from Durkheim around the social, and then this other one that you're taking from social psychology around construal level. So I wonder if you want to give just for those of us that need that little review, kind of what the overview of your theory is, as you've taken the pebble out and done a first go at it of what it is, how we can organize that, because then I think from there, then a lot of other things kind of help our discussion.
Let me just start right out with the framing. There's a sense in which social science should just be easier than most people make it. So after all these years learning very complicated math and statistics and sophisticated methods and understanding how to read the very most advanced papers in these fields, I've decided that there's a simpler approach that just works better, that we could just be using a lot more. And the reason we don't use it is because it doesn't look so sophisticated. But in fact, it's intellectually productive. So the simple approach, so in the world, we tend to divide things into empiricists and theorists. Empiricists basically take some data set and they make a formal model of the data and try to estimate parameters about this data set with some sort of an eye to some sort of parameters that are interesting with respect to some theoretical perspective, but they mostly inherit, the theory perspectives that people say, and they just want to do precise parameter estimates. That's what they do on the one side. On the other side, there are theorists, and they take some standard theoretical framework, and they try to work out a game theory or math model, or often even agent-based models, computer models, to try to take some particular set of theoretical assumptions and to work out their implications in more detail. So there's these theorists and there's the empiricists. Now, the actual task of social science, as in all the rest of the science, is really to match data to theory. It isn't just to estimate data more precisely and then work out theory consequences more precisely. It's to actually do the matching. Is to say, well, which theories better fit the data? That's our actual task. But to do that, mostly you just need relatively simple qualitative summaries of the data. You don't actually need really precise estimates of complicated models on the one side. On the other side, you just mainly need to know what are roughly the empirical predictions of the different theories. And then you want to do a match where you line them up and you say, okay, here's roughly our summary of the data, and here's the various theories. Which of these theories roughly matches the data better? And to do that, it can be pretty qualitative. And in fact, most of the data you're trying to match isn't even the result of complicated empirical studies. It's just stuff in your world that you might notice about your world. Like children go to school and then they work as adults, or we sleep at night, or just very basic things like that. And there's a lack of people doing this simple matching, collecting rough summaries of data, collecting a set of alternative theories, and just saying, okay, which match where? And I think that's neglected, and so that's my method. And honestly, we could just make a lot more progress if more people would use this method, and few do. But that's what I decided to do here in the Sacred. I didn't collect a big data set and try to do a big complicated analysis. On the data side, I just said, okay, let's just collect all the things people say go along with the Sacred. Whatever those things are. I'm not going to be that picky about checking their data and proving exactly how robust it is. I just want to collect a list of all the things people say tend to go along with the Sacred on the one side. On the other side, I just want to collect what are the main stories that people would give about what the heck this is about. And then just do the qualitative match. And that's my method here to try to do that. So the stories I collected, or looking at the literature, what are the standard stories people say? One of them was from Durkheim. And when I looked at the data and summarized them, we can elaborate more on that at the moment, there was a pretty good match with Durkheim's story with a fair number of the correlates of the Sacred. So, quickly, I collected 68 correlates, and there's some redundancy in there, and I wasn't trying to be that picky about making sure there's no redundancy. And then I collected these correlates into 7 themes, and then I was doing the matching with the themes. Now, I have to say, in the last day, going back and reading these 78 correlates, there's a lot in there that isn't well summarized by those 7 themes. I think there's a lot more work one could do digging into those correlates and trying to make more sense of them, and summarizing them better perhaps than I did, and trying to match against theory. But still, I think for a first cut, this was a fine approach. 68 correlates summarized into 7 themes, and then asking which of the theories explain those themes. So briefly, the 7 themes summarized of the Sacred are: we value the Sacred, 1. We show we value it in our emotions and our actions, things like that. We don't just do the valuing, we want to show the value. 3rd, groups are bound together by sharing a view of the Sacred. That 4th, we set the Sacred apart from other things. We like a clean distinction, don't like them to be mixed up. 5th, we idealize the Sacred. We see it as more perfect and less flawed and simpler than other things. And 6, we have a norm or a habit of intuiting and feeling and emoting with respect to the Sacred, and seeing aesthetic judgments as important there, as opposed to logic and analysis and numbers. And 7th, we often have concrete things in our world that are seen as especially sacred by association with the abstract, such as, say, religious relics or something, or a love letter or a flag. There's distinctly a way in which specific things become strikingly potent with respect to the sacred. So those are the 7 correlates. So, and again, looking at the theories, honestly, Durkheim, founder of sociology, first guy to really talk a lot about the sacred, saying sacred is the essence of religion. A lot of people accept that. And then his story that the essence of sacred is to bind groups together. That was my third theme. And honestly, that third theme does explain the first 2 pretty well. If you're going to bind groups together, with the view of the sacred, then of course they should value the sacred highly and go out of their way to show that they value, so that they can bind together by showing they value it. So 3 out of the 7 work pretty well there. And honestly, that looked better to me than any of the other specific simple theories I could find to try to explain these. And so then my challenge was, well, what about the other 4? The sacred is this complicated thing. There's a lot going on there. And I happen to know about, this is the advantage of being a polymath who for many years just collects lots of things I know about. I happen to know about construal level theory in psychology, where I learned about it reading a Science magazine article, in 2008 or something. And that seemed like a really powerful insight at the time, pretty robust. And so I've remembered that for a long time. And that turned out that adding that to Durkheim's story could plausibly explain the other 4. And so construal level theory briefly is just the idea that our thinking is structured very much in terms of abstract versus concreteness. Things that are close up, a few things up close, we tend to focus on their details and look at specific details, but many small things far away, we tend to think about abstractly, i.e. with relatively little detail. And so when we think about things far away abstractly, we just think about them differently, consistently, and we have this very consistent mental habit of categorizing everything as near versus far and invoking one habit or the other. And there's a bunch of correlates with how we think about things far away versus up close. That's construal level theory. And then here, as long as I'm at this point, here's the key insight. This habit of thinking about some things up close versus far away is an obstacle to seeing things the same. Say, if we think about medicine as sacred, if you're sick, I'm not. You see your sickness up close, I see it far away. If you therefore see it differently because you're sick and I see it differently because I'm not, that will be an obstacle to us seeing it the same and then binding together over a shared view of it. And that obstacle can be overcome if we switch our usual habit of seeing near things concretely and far things abstractly to instead take the particular things we're going to treat as sacred and see them from afar abstractly, even when they're close. And that will be a cost because usually we have a benefit from paying attention to details up close. That lets us reason more specifically and accurately about those details and make more specific judgments. But that comes at the cost of having us see things differently and not seeing things the same, so that we pay that cost to see it as if from afar, even when we're close, in order to bind together. So plausibly then, for example, in medicine, we actually suffer because individuals are not very willing to look at their own medical treatment, to be critical about it, to ask for second opinions, to look up the literature, things like that, to be questioning. They aren't willing to do that about medicine because they go into this sacred mode toward medicine where they try to see it from afar in a distance. They just want to trust their doctor. They just want to think about it abstractly. And that means they don't do as well in reasoning about medicine, but we are bound together more strongly through our shared view of medicine that allows us to be a strongly bound community. So I probably spent too long there giving my summary, but that's the quick summary.
Yeah, no, I think it's really key to start thinking, and for us here to, as we start thinking of examples in our reading and in our experience about what kinds of things we would call sacred or other people call sacred. I think that construal level theory has some interesting wrinkles as I tried to digest it. One of which is around I mean, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that it implies to me is it gives a little bit of an account of hypocrisy, or the way that
Sure. Yes.
representatives of the sacred, whether it be clergy or whether it be, a cult leader, or whoever, who ends up representing, or having the authority for the sacred, can afford to really neglect a lot of details, or kind of brush over a lot of details, and
Sure.
that construal level seems to tie into that if you're holding, that you're taking advantage of that um, function that you're talking about, and uh, while getting away with what, in more typical encounters, someone would say, hey, are you fixing breakfast or not? You're not talking about the wonders of grain and agricultural, or food in the abstract. Is that, would you kind of agree with that, or
Right. So as I said, there's a cost to treating something as sacred, which is that you're not going to be paying as much attention to the details. And that means you won't be being as critical or carefully evaluating in ways that you would if you were treating it as less sacred. But the benefit is then we see things the same. So, for example, that gives doctors more freedom. If we are not looking critically at our doctors, we are just going to trust them, and then they have more discretion to pursue whatever ends they have because we're not paying as close attention. Like, for example, we don't treat auto mechanics nearly as sacred, so we're more willing to distrust an auto mechanic. They tell us we need a new transmission. They say, but I just replaced it last year. We might say, no, you can't, that can't be right. But with medical doctors, we are less willing to be that critical, and that gives them more discretion. Now, how they use that isn't necessarily against us, but it could be, but that's an issue. So with priests of the sacred, this is just a general issue. There's a number of issues that are interesting with respect to priests of the sacred. So obviously, one thing we do is we elevate priests of the sacred to higher status and prestige. And we often believe, often incorrectly, that by selecting for the most prestigious people and putting them in charge of things, we are protecting ourselves against malfeasance because, well, low people might cheat us, prestigious people would not. So we're safe, therefore, from prestigious doctors mistreating us because, it would only be some lowlife who would do that. So we give our priests high status, and we give them a lot of discretion in the sense that we don't look as carefully at what they're doing, and we let them judge each other and choose and evaluate each other. Interestingly, the priests of the sacred have to look at details. So the detail is shoved in their face. So the priests have more of a problem actually maintaining their view of the sacred on the topic they are the priests of, because they will just be so overwhelmed with the details. So, famously, actually, religious priests have trouble maintaining their faith more than more ordinary people because they are immersed in this faith all the time, and they see, how things work behind the scenes and the actual effects on things. And similarly, for example, look, I'm a teacher. Some of you may be teachers. We teachers are priests of a certain kind of sacred, and we, in fact, know that school isn't quite as idealized as people like to say. We can see that directly in the fact that our students don't learn that much. They don't seem to be that motivated. This stuff doesn't actually seem to be that highbrow, et cetera. So that's a problem. We teachers, but we manage to keep up this appearance of belief in education enough. But basically, our students and the world isn't looking too closely about whether we've lost our faith. And that's generally true for doctors and other kinds of priests. We hold them to high prestigious standards, and we elevate them, and then we don't actually look very carefully. Are you really still devoted to this thing? When they show us doubts, we're tolerant of that. Say, yeah, that's fine. You can have doubts about this thing. We'll believe in it, but you can have doubts.
hmm. Yeah, that's I think that it's quite true. I mean, the next time a student uh, complains about a grade and really just digs in, of like, please, it's another way of kind of thinking, all right, this is not the nobility of teaching that usually people are thinking I'm supposed to uphold when you have to confront those, or the pastor who, the pipes are frozen in the church, and it's, you got to, that has to work. I mean, whether or not you are stuck in your sermon, the pipes need to be working. One issue, or one thing that,
I just add the
oh yeah,
note there. Sorry,
sure.
just like, and I think that's a really, really good example of, the going back to the 68 components comprising the sacred, or the themes around the sacred, because where I'm from, professors are sacred.
In Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I think it's a far more hierarchical society. Students don't pay. So the professor who's really underpaid is doing you a favor, even doing anything for you. And it's a completely different vibe. I think you do have it in the US in very specific fields, like maybe in science, if you're like studying with a Nobel laureate or something. I'm pretty sure Richard Feynman got a lot of deferred type behaviors. But I think that's a really interesting, just a note, right? Where Durkheim was writing from was probably also more hierarchical than where we're analyzing him from right now.
So I want to make a point here that I didn't realize was as important when I wrote this essay, which is that it's really striking how many different things we treat as sacred, and that different societies really treat different things in terms of different emphases. It's the same list of things that are overall has a positive valence, but which or how sacred is varied a lot across time and across societies. And so, I did some polls about, which things my followers thought were more sacred, and asked a bunch of different questions, but that's a striking fact about the sacred. And it's a fact that the people who are the most fans of the sacred are uncomfortable with. So if you actually look at people who talk the most about the sacred, the reason they talk about it is because for them, there is a sacred thing that they treat as the most sacred, and they think it is the sacred thing. They don't think it's just a thing we happen to treat as sacred. In their mind, the reason why that's sacred is it deserves to be treated as sacred. So for example, religious folks, obvious examples, but even some doctors for medicine or whatever, for most people, the reason they're interested in the concept of the sacred is that they think that there are some particular things that they treat as very sacred, not just because their culture happens to do so, but because it, in fact, deserves to be treated as sacred. And that's why the sacred is interesting. So for them, it's somewhat awkward to come into this framing saying, well, looks like people treat things as sacred. I wonder what the patterns are and how we could explain that. Because they're going, no, you're missing the point. Sure, people might bond together by treating it as sacred, but look, it is sacred. And in their mind, go ahead.
Not just what is sacred, but first of all, how many individual sacred things you can have in your life, right? In the US, you have a lot of individual sacred things. Like I live in the US, and it's always surprising and amazing to me how here, for instance, an individual's will is sacred. Where I'm from, no. Like you say something and then other people are like, no, shut up, and we move on. Here it's like you have to listen. Like this is the personhood is sacred. And I think that's amazing, and it contributes to a lot of really good cultural outcomes. But also so you have the individual versus collective, but you also have the arbitrariness of sacred. So in more progressive societies, a person can choose more overtly that this glass is sacred to me or in my culture or in my family. And you guys will be like, great, for Anna, that's sacred. Let's leave the glass alone, right? Try that in France, or try in France to say that your prophet is sacred, and you will still be questioned. They will be like, no. I think there's something
so
about leverage
one key norm of the sacred among the 68 correlates is that we tend to believe that sacred things don't actually conflict with each other. There isn't a trade-off. So that's why we can see many things as sacred and not see that as somewhat arbitrary, because we see them as all part of the same big sacred thing, which don't have conflicts. Now, historically, say a few centuries ago,
and you realize it's like you watch like an Arsenal game and you're like, I don't know about the no conflict there.
Right, but we actually do have many conflicts, and that's some of the most difficult things for people who embrace the sacred to deal with, is when there seem to be conflicts. They will struggle very hard to find a way to see it as not really in conflict. The conflict is only an appearance. The real, true versions of these things aren't in conflict. Somehow it's only we aren't approaching the true versions that's causing the apparent conflict. Now, up until a few centuries ago, we had a shared sense of who was the authority over the sacred. So, medicine and school were still sacred, but religion was the premier sacred, and religion is what authorized you to treat other things as sacred. Other things are only sacred because the premier sacred approved of the other things being treated as sacred. But the other things were still treated as sacred. We had a central authority who could adjudicate over that. And I think the biggest thing that's happened in the last century or so is we've lost that central authority over the sacred. And now we just have lots of different things that we treat as sacred, and then we each disagree perhaps about which thing is more, and we don't have so much of a way to adjudicate, a shared way to adjudicate that. We just have different things we see as sacred.
Yeah, one thing that you brought up glass, like a glass, and I was thinking about devotional objects, which I think are on the one hand very near, and we can know them very well. At the same time, there seems to be, I think what your approach is pointing out is that they are detailed, but only in some aspects. And they're more like portals to that abstract, far perspective. I mean, so Wittgenstein talks about this with when he's going off on the Golden Bough. Fraser's Golden Bough is of looking at religion and the sacred as just primitive explanation, primitive science that's just, underdeveloped thinking, inferior theory. You think you're going to do something and get an effect. And Wittgenstein points out all these examples of, when I kiss a picture of my deceased loved one, I'm not thinking, I'm literally, touching their body, or it's not a cause effect in that type of way. It's very close, and yet there's clearly this person is gone. This is, I'm relating to this person in a more abstract way than I would if I'm, cooking up or cleaning after them, or saying that they're being annoying. And I think that's devotional objects. He talks about Schubert's brother, when Schubert's scores, after Schubert died, that he cut up Schubert's scores and gave little slices to pieces to his students. And he said, that makes sense as being, treating Schubert's scores as kind of sacred, but it would be just as sacred if he burned them all, which it's almost as, that we have these ways where we recognize, yeah, you can do very different things with these objects and still have that function, that they're being, I think, the fourth theme of set apart in some way, or idealized. So I don't know if you've thought about the devotional objects.
To remind you that the seventh theme was this concrete feature, that the concrete touching thing, that specific stuff becomes sacred through this abstract association, like a flag or a love letter. They represent this abstract, and they let us connect more directly to the abstract by making them concrete. That's one of the themes to explain. I wanted to respond, to the point, many people see the sacred as primitive, as, a holdover from some, irrational past. But it seems to be pretty clear that pretty much everyone in our society has stuff they treat as sacred. If they don't know, then they are sort of a bit ignorant about their attitudes towards things, but everyone. So for example, in my world of intellectuals, I think the premier sacred thing is honesty, truth. And you can see that that's sacred because people are not willing to make trade-offs there. At least not consciously willing to make trade-offs there. And they idealize it. So you could say, well, look, if somebody paid you a little, shouldn't you be willing to slant your number just a little, maybe lie a little? Well, you could get maybe more people to listen, just exaggerate a bit. Surely there's some trade-offs here, and getting more attention should be worth a little bit of lying. And, you know, a little bit of mixing with money is here. Take some money to slant your stuff in one direction, and that'll give you more stuff overall. It'll all be better. And people are just, no. They treat this as sacred. Honesty and truth are sacred to them in our world in a way that isn't reflected in just a, you know, consequential value of it would be good if we learned more and could spread it all. They want to set it apart, elevate it, and hold it as a sacred principle they're willing to sacrifice for. They're willing to make quite a bit of sacrifice for the truth. They're proud of that. Even they are losing on consequences, but yay, they sacrifice for the truth. That, and I have to admit, I feel some of that sense myself as well. That's showing you that we treat that as sacred.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's really suggestive for expanding or helping identify certain things that are functioning in the sacred, even if people are not immediately drawn to call it that. And I mean, you know, getting back to your original motivation, I'm you know, wondering about how we understand change along these lines, because rituals change, adaptations come, and I was wondering about your thoughts about, because it seems like within the terms of the theory, you could elaborate or describe what was happening uh, in terms of how a ritual was able to change without the whole community or you know the symbol structure collapsing altogether. So it's not an all or one proposition. Does that resonate with you, that you know that you could say, okay, this is no longer set apart in the same way? I mean, I'm thinking about world religious traditions, you know, that have to,
Right?
you know, span societies. And I mean, you know, famously, for Christianity, you know, you have the most profane thing to be crucified, you know, the most profane thing that you just don't do according to the law. This is not what a religious leader happens to a religious leader, as this axis of saying, well, but if you look at it differently, then there's a different, way to understand all of that.
Clearly, traditional societies, once you had had tradition and practice for a while, that habit, through the sort of touching of it and the nostalgia, it made it more sacred. That is, there's a habit. I'm 65 years old, so by now I know that in just one human lifetime, things that you just have a habitual connection to become more sacred to you personally through that habituation and through nostalgia. So clearly, you know, the ancient world, once when things were just not changing very often, that was a strength of tradition that enforced the sacredness of things that hadn't been changing for a long time. And they could see most of their major traditions and habits, et cetera, as pretty sacred. And so the interesting modern innovation, which we're still playing out, is to turn around and decide that innovation is sacred. So we have decided to celebrate and, you know, valorize innovation. And then we even have, you know, visionary inventors as priests of innovation. And that's how we then are eager for change. And say in social or political realms, we have the revolutionary as a saint, a political activist as a saint. And like the story of, say, Jesus is a story of change. You know, it's a story of a person who showed up and then things changed. And the story, you know, that we can celebrate that as an innovation, or Paul coming along, right? There are these acts of people who change things, and that we can celebrate when, if we flip it around and we talk about, yeah, we want to do more things like that, where we figure out what could be changed and changed it. So in our modern world, we have tried and successfully succeeded to a substantial extent in making innovation sacred.
Jen, you've got a question.
I don't want to go off topic. You had said a few minutes ago, kind of going back to your, hi Robin, going back to your original motivation. So I was kind of going back to there. I was thinking of institutions, and you saying that this was all kind of motivated by you trying to make institutional change, running up against brick walls, tracking it down to the fact that people were saying things are sacred and you can't touch these sacred things. I really, it really resonated when you said that the people that you elevate to priest status then no longer have the luxury of looking at it from afar and treating it with sacredness. They have the details shoved in their face and they sort of like lose their faith. And I'm wondering if you have come to any sort of like messages of hope. I feel like there's a place in between where someone comes to an institution with like a medical student or a lawyer comes through school with this idealistic vision that, yes, there are some toxic things in this institution, but I can come in there from the inside and make some changes. And then they're going to do the same thing you did, which is hit up against these brick walls. No, you can't change this. It's sacred. It's sacred. It's sacred. But having gone through this process, is there hope? Like, have you found, what can we do here?
Right.
What are we going to do with all this information that you've gathered for us now that we
Right.
have?
So one thing is that in the last century or longer, we came to treat cultural activists as saints. And we're really eager to get behind what looks like a new version of a cultural activism crusade, a rise of a new religion, if you will. So one way to promote change is, in fact, to make it seem like a moral crusade. It isn't just some efficient rearrangement of things. You want to make it seem like, there is something moral at stake there, something sacred at stake, and then to hold out that sacred vision of what you might be achieving and contrast it with what you'll call the profane status quo, which is not achieving the sacred heights possible. You will make this a sacred war, if you like, for your change. That's a thing that works in our world. Now, unfortunately, it means those new sacred campaigns don't pay that much attention then to the mechanical details of actually getting things right, because they're more focused on inspiring people with, a sacred war. But there is energy for change aplenty, to the extent that you can make something seem a conflict between the sacred and profane, and your change is to try to rescue your local world from this profane, swamp that it has fallen into, compared to the sacred heights that it could rise to. So that's one thing. Now, as an economist, I have been focusing attention on sort of the mechanical details and efficiency. And I came to realize that one of the main obstacles is just the idea that money is profane. Okay. So, of course, most of the institutions I think of innovating have money as a central feature. As an economist, that's not surprising. And then people say, look, we don't want to like make money more relevant in these sacred areas. That's right there a problem. So in thinking about that, I realized there's actually plausibly a nice, simple solution, which is sacred money. Money doesn't have to be profane. The thing that makes money profane in most people's eyes is the fact that you could use it to buy all sorts of profane stuff. You're allowed to go use money to, eat fatty food or hire a prostitute or, pay people to throw dwarves or whatever it is people think is profane. You're allowed to use money to do that. And that's, in a sense, the reason why money seems profane. So whenever we set up a system where money would be part of the motivating force, people back off and they go, ooh, we've got this sacred cause and you're messing with money. And the reason we say is because you pay some people some money to like be a priest and they could go use it to buy dwarf tossing. I mean, how does that make any sense? Right? But you realize, oh, well, we could just make a kind of money that you weren't allowed to use to do dwarf tossing or prostitutes, whatever else it is. And now all of a sudden, it doesn't have that profane aspect. So, for example, think of a hospital, say, right? There are for-profit hospitals and nonprofit hospitals, and many people dislike the idea of a for-profit hospital because they dislike the idea that somebody could make money promoting medicine or health, but then go use the money for profane things. They'd like, with the nonprofit, to have it all be sacred money. So, the idea, if you donate money to a nonprofit and it has a sacred cause, then we think of that as sacred money, and therefore that's not the problem. It's not a problem of money that nonprofits for sacred causes use money, because we have the idea they're only using it for these sacred purposes. And therefore, the money's been cleaned somehow by being transferred to them and their purposes, right? So, but the problem with nonprofits, you see, is the capital investment. For-profit hospitals, if there's a new capital opportunity, for-profit capitalists can show up with a lot of capital and make a lot of things happen. Where with nonprofits, they have to only, take the money that they save from not spending it over time. It's harder for nonprofits to slowly accumulate capital to expand their activities. And that's why when there were periods of expansion in hospital activity, it was mostly through for-profit hospital expansions, because that's where capital can come from, right? But if we had sacred capital that could only be used for sacred ventures, why, you could have sacred capitalists who invest in sacred ventures and get return on their sacred capital to invest in more sacred ventures, and not a problem. So this is actually a solution, I think, that could work for many of our sacred areas. Is we should just set aside, allow people the creation of sacred capital, and then so we actually have this in our tax law and in other sorts of laws. That is, we have the idea that there are nonprofits who get tax exemption if they are used for certain purposes. And that money dedicated to those purposes gets treated differently by tax law, and it gets treated by, say, laws of inheritance and things like that. We already have this concept. We just don't have the sacred capital part, where by converting ordinary money to sacred money and then committing to it can only be used for sacred ventures, then you can invest it in a sacred venture, gets a return, reinvest that later, and be a sacred capitalist who accumulates sacred capital to reinvest in all sorts of flexible new ventures as they show up. That's the benefit of capitalism.
But
So, go ahead.
We do have sacred capital on the individual level, right? I mean, on the individual level, families, people who want to live virtuously, I don't know, you inherit something from your grandmother who survived the Holocaust. You're probably
but say you want to donate to a hospital, right?
But there's you stop yourself. There's no external rule to stop you. It's your
no. But still, if there's just a for-profit hospital, you could just donate to them, but you don't get a return on your investment to the for-profit hospital. You can either invest in a for-profit hospital, or you can donate to a nonprofit hospital.
Financial return, but you get a return in a healthier society, and children survive.
Right, but I want you to get a financial return, because that's how capitalism works.
I
want you to get a financial return in sacred capital.
I think we do this in a way in families where, I have people on my team who work here particularly to set aside money for their kids' education, and that's sacred capital, right? They don't touch it, they put it there. Even if their washing machine breaks down, that's there. We have, to go back to inheritance, this money that we inherit from grandma, we will buy an apartment for the kid. There is financial return in the sense that the apartment will, the value will increase eventually. It is a kind of sacred capital, just in a super backstage invisible way.
But the world out there has these limitations on institutions like for-profit hospitals, et cetera, because of the perception that they're using profane money. So if we could change that perception, we could do it by formally making the money there sacred. The people who have, if you have money, you can use it for sacred purposes, but other people don't necessarily know that that's what you're going to do. So they don't necessarily trust you to get money, because they fear that you might use it for profane purposes. So we want a way to commit money to sacred purposes, so that we'll have fewer legal restrictions on how you can use it. And the key point of capitalism is that not just that people have capital and they spend it on things. The point of capitalism, you invest capital and you get more capital back if you make good choices. And we have a huge, powerful selection and growth effect of more and more capital being created by people making more and more good choices with capital. That's the thing we're missing in the nonprofit world.
Yeah, it's a really interesting uh, proposal. And I mean, to me, it reminds me of that. In my experience with churches, the pledge drive is a very fraught time, and yet it's something that is, I think, more and more people try to make sacred. You know, that budgets are sacred. And in fact, I've heard a pastor say church budget is a sacred document. You know, to basically be working in the opposite direction of saying we need to lose some of our associations with money as strictly utilitarian, or that we're trying to buy salvation or something like that. That it needs to be reframed. But it's a kind of ongoing struggle, I think, for the reasons that your theory helps to underscore. That if it seems to be too much in the ordinary circulation of means to ends, that it isn't set apart enough, isn't idealized enough.
Also, to answer Jennifer's question further, one of the main things that I've noticed about broken institutions is that we rely heavily on prestige for many things. So for like medicine or law, and even in governance, when we are worried about things and they are somewhat sacred, we tend to say, oh, let's just have the most prestigious people run that thing. People who go to the best colleges or from the best families or whatever. And we tend to presume that that somehow fixes the problem. And I think that it often just doesn't fix the problem very much, and that we should have institutions based on money. And so part of the thing here is to try to find a way to get people to distrust prestige. And part of the problem is that we mix up prestige with the sacred so much that it seems sacrilegious to distrust prestige. Harvard isn't just a place where smart people who make a lot of money go. It is a priests of our society. Harvard is a priest factory. And we decide that people from Harvard can be trusted to run banks and whatever else it is. And if they run them, then we don't have to monitor them and we don't have to check them, because they're just good people, because they are elites. That's just a common human reaction that we use to manage many areas. And I struggle to try to get people to see otherwise, but I think the prestige really adds, there's a way in which prestige and the sacred are mixed in strongly together. Elites aren't just better, they are sacred better.
And I think that picks up the later themes, like you were saying, around things that cannot be verbalized easily or explained easily. That's often what you hear with the prestige. You know, why do they need to be on the Supreme Court? Well, you just have to know them. You know, you just have to know. If you knew them, you know,
right?
They're just amazing, right?
I mean, you could know the janitor and like the janitor, but not be impressed and want to put them on the Supreme Court, right? Put somebody on the Supreme Court, they need to be impressive. They need to have the gravitas of all sorts of elite associations, and to basically be prestigious.
In the chat, Tina mentioned change management, which is an interesting point around, you know, that there are thinking about institutional change and what it takes. Tina, I don't know if you're on or want to ask that yourself, but about where you were going with it. But the interesting
yes,
point.
I am. But I don't consider myself an expert on change management. I do data work anyways right now. But yeah, I think Robin, you had a great point about sometimes kind of the entire change management. You need to be in the conductive environment to it, right? So you need to fundamentally have people who are impacted by this on board, and that's when you can realistically start accomplishing things. And if nobody kind of like questions that status quo and you're the only person in there who kind of like disagrees with it, it instantly gets really complex really fast.
What sort of organizations were you thinking about change within?
Just in general, I work in engineering spaces right now. So that was just like one thing, but my original background was in business management.
So this work on the sacred, I, did up until about a year ago. You can see the date on this paper was about a year ago. And since then, I focused a lot on fertility and culture. And there's a sense in which culture is sacred. And change management is typically about culture. That is the main thing that organizations typically want and need to change is their culture. And often culture is another name for all the social complexities that are hard to see and understand and control. And that's a way in which we've often, treated things more sacredly when they were just hard to see and understand and control. The mysterious, wise universe. And we often treat our culture as this mysterious, wise thing that, shapes our lives without, us being able to see it very well. And, typically for most organizations, even for for-profit organizations, for self-respect, they need to find a way to see themselves as about something other than profit. They find a story about what they're there for, and they're there to serve these customers. They're there to make bridges. They're there to, make people's, whatever the customers are getting. They want to set that up as a sacred goal that they are about, so that they can see themselves as united around some more sacred goal. And yes, they need to make profits, but that's just a necessary condition for being able to do something. And then that's going to be one of the main levers for cultural change, is to get people to see that to achieve the sacred goal of their culture, of their organization, they would need a culture that was better matched to that sacred goal. And if you can get people to see that, then you could get them behind change. In ways you unfortunately can't get them behind change just to reduce inefficiencies, unless you can say, look, unless we cut these inefficiencies, we're just going to go out of business and die, and then we won't be able to achieve our sacred purpose.
I mean, I was interested in, on that trajectory, what your thoughts are, or what we might think about technology in particular as a aspect of innovation, and as a support for that type of organizational mission, because it seems that looking at the sacred actually helps show why the technology can generate both a lot of hope and a lot of grand hype, projection, and at the same time a lot of almost visceral resistance, and this is creepy, or I don't want this technology to be taking over this or that function. It seems like your theory could have a lot to say around what it is that technology represents, or could represent, to an institution.
Right. So we economists argue for technology on the basis of, increasing the size of the economy and letting us all have more wealth to get more of all of what we want. But unfortunately, none of that seems very sacred to most people. So you might think, well, then why do we tolerate technology? So obviously, all technology is disruptive. The sense when it changes is that it gets in your way, forces you to abandon traditions, adjust to, working in different places, different industries, different methods. So at the nearest level, technology is disruptive, and often it messes with things we consider sacred. So if you think about IVF, say, as a technology for having kids, but people thought it messed with their religious concepts of reproduction, and they were pretty resistant to it, even though they might envision the concrete practical benefits. If it goes up against sacred traditions and views, then it seems to be something people would want to ban. So you might wonder, how could we have a society with so much technical change if most particular technology changes are trouble and often seem to undermine our nostalgia, at least, and often our sacred values? And I think the key thing that we've done is to see, well, and one thing we did, of course, was to just see innovation as patriotism, which is somewhat sacred. That is, if our nation doesn't allow enough innovation, then their nations will win, and then they will win wars against us, and we will lose. For a long time, say a century to 2 centuries ago, that was a major reason why people allowed innovation, was because of patriotism, which was sacred. But I think patriotism rationale is much less now. There is the inertia of just, this is the way we're doing things, so why not continue? But I actually think the major reason that tech gets such room to make changes is that the innovation itself is sacred. That is, we celebrate the innovators as our peak prestigious people, our saints of our world, Steve Jobs or whoever, Elon Musk even today. He will be seen as a saint, I'm pretty sure. And that's central to our self-concept, that we want to be a society with exemplary saints, peak performers, and these people, that's the medium of their art, is innovation. And we feel very reluctant to mess with their showing how spectacularly prestigious and capable they are through their innovation. That's, I guess you think about, say, AI in the last few years, there's huge amounts of money going into AI, not actually that much, business value being produced,
Right.
but it makes us all really proud that we are the people associated with these people who made this spectacular achievement that will go down in history as, wow, that was just better than anything before. The people who came up with that, they just must be really great people.
I'll get back to that theme, but Adam, you've got a question.
Yeah, so thank you, Robin, for doing this. My question, I'm coming at this as a philosopher, and I've taught some of the literature on expressivist objections to markets. And I'm wondering if there's a bunch of different phenomena that are being subsumed under the umbrella of the sacred. So you've given, there's a couple of different examples that I've written down. You consider honesty or truth for a scholar to be sacred. Sort of attitudes towards European professors, deference to authority is sacred. Before you actually started talking, I thought that you would be referring to stuff like attitudes towards bodily integrity as sacred, but I don't think that's come up yet. And these, we use the same word, or it makes sense to use the same word for all of these things, but if you put pressure on what actually is distinctive, there seems to be different issues. So with honesty, you might say that it has an infinite price, or it has some special role in your utility function that it doesn't admit of trade-offs. So it has to do with the kind of value that attaches to it. For deference to authority, you might say that it's certain sacred figures deserve a specific kind of trust. And if you're thinking that the body is sacred, and so you shouldn't be able to sell your kidneys, that might have to do with seeing the body as the human body as having some kind of divine significance. So there's some picture in the background of a source of the value that's driving this sense of sacredness. And so I'm wondering, do you feel like there's a bunch of different things that you're capturing with the notion of sacred that maybe have to do with kind of value, infinite versus finite, or source of value? So yeah, that's.
Thanks, Adam. So there's a standard distinction between lumpers and splitters. and I'm going to classify you as splitter. That is, when there are concepts that contain many things they cover, sometimes people are tempted to say, no, there's just a bunch of separate concepts here. They may have some similarities, but there is no shared concept. And then that's the splitter sort of stance. And then the lumper sort of stance is to look at things that are similar and suggest, well, there's something they share underlying that that's causing that similarity, which is the common underlying thing they have. So here I am obviously treating sacred as a lump in the sense that there are all these different things we treat as sacred. And not only do they have similar, features, I'm postulating a common cause of those similar features. And a common cause here would be a general human habit or a general human capacity for treating things as sacred. But we can play this game, of course, with you could talk about fear, right? I could say people have a capacity to be afraid. And you might say, no, there's fear of cats, and there's fear of landslides, and there's fear of death, and there's fear of choking. And those are just different things. And they might have some superficial commonality, but we should just talk about these separate fears and not talk about fear as a thing, right? But this is just an issue we have with all of our concept, basically. There's a question of how much explanatory power do you need to see from postulating a common cause of similar but not identical things before you're willing to accept that there is a common underlying cause? And so here, I've done this game many times across many concepts in my lifetime, and it looks to me like so obviously one bet is when we have a word for many different things, that is a judgment by some people that there is something in common there. But of course, sometimes we have the same word for multiple concepts. And then the fact that it's the same word doesn't necessarily mean they have multiple. But in dictionaries, you make that distinction, you list different concepts. And so the use of words is a bet that there is an underlying structure that's worth using to represent things that differ to some degree. Economists have been reluctant to invoke concepts that, say, sociologists often use as a habit. So economists are reluctant to invoke status, the sacred, happiness. There's just lots of other words that don't have a direct mapping into the usual economic concepts. And then I've often seen economists just go, let's not talk about those other words. Let's just try to find ways to, map their specific instances on our usual words, and then I don't have to mess with that, right? But I do think I've spent enough time outside of economics to say, no, look, a lot of these other fields, they've identified concepts, and those are useful concepts, and they do mean something. And so I'm more of an ecumenical, I'm no longer an economist in some sense. I'm just a scholar who collects insights from lots of different fields, and I tend to mostly accept the concepts as provided by these fields and try to work with them and combine them with concepts elsewhere. I mostly don't say that a whole field is just completely wrong in their concepts. I think they might be misusing it or misunderstanding a bit, but most concepts that have words, there is something behind it.
So may I just ask
Please.
So in this literature on the expressionist objections to markets, I mean, you're probably familiar with it. It includes like pieces by Alvin Roth. Jason Brennan wrote a book on it. The splitter approach is, I think, the one that most of these theorists take when they're trying to figure out what are the reasons why people tend to be opposed to, say, markets and prostitution. Legalizing prostitution or markets and kidney sales. The splitter approach, rather than the lumping approach, is better at getting at the bottom of things. So I would think that if your interest in the sacred is at least partly motivated by trying to find ways of getting around these objections to markets, then you would want to take the splitter as opposed to the lumping approach.
Well, let's take your example of prostitution. What would be, your favorite explanation there? I mean, I would say we tend to see sex and love as sacred, and that's one of the reasons we don't want money messing with the sacred of love and sex. That's my sacred account of why we're reluctant to have legalized prostitution. What would be your preferred alternative story?
well, I don't have a preferred one, but a couple of different examples would be legalizing prostitution leads to exploitation of the most vulnerable. And then you might have what Jason Brennan calls these semiotic objections, like it maybe sends the wrong message when people are paying for paying for sex, or that it degrades sex. So there's a couple of different reasons why you might be opposed to legalized prostitution.
But sending the wrong message is going to have to be about this respect we want to show to the sacred. That is,
Right.
yes.
Okay.
You say, but why? What bad message does it sell if people can buy sex? It doesn't send a bad message about potatoes if you can buy them. Why would it send a bad message about sex if you can buy it? And the exploitation, again, I don't think there's any obvious reason why that sort of labor would be more exploitative than digging ditches or all sorts of other jobs. I think you have to see it as sacred in order to understand why people are extra sensitive to things that could be labeled exploitation in that scenario compared to other scenarios.
Okay, so you think that even with the sort of sifting approach, at the bottom of all of these objections to markets is some idea of the sacred and the profane?
Well, I mean, a different standard story about prostitution, say, is that women don't want competition. There are women who have a husband and they don't want their husband to have easy access to competition in prostitutes, and it's a market control of limiting access to competition. So that's a different sort of story. That's not a sacred story. Okay. But I don't think that's a splitter story exactly, because that's a pretty standard category of explanations. That's a large category of explanations where we explain behavior in terms of trying to limit market competition to your product. It's why we have tariffs, for example. And, of course, the usual challenge is, but why do the people who want to limit competition end up having more influence than the people who want to promote competition? And so then you might say, yes, sure, women don't want as much competition, but the men want more competition. Why do the women win? And then I think you'll have to appeal to something more like the sacred to talk about why they win that rhetorical battle.
I think that makes sense, because you first want to limit some kind of behavior. I don't think that prostitution is about competition. I know what you mean, but it's not competition. It's if we follow that logic, then women don't want, or some women don't want to lose insight into a large part of their partner's life. So it's more about belonging and the unit and control. I think that
right. So in that sense, you're trying to enforce a contract that you can't figure out how to directly enforce.
Social contract.
He might be willing to agree to a contract not to see the prostitute, but unless you make prostitution illegal, you're worried you can't really enforce that contract.
But what interests me here is, so I want to achieve a certain behavior to stop usually. So I make a rule. I think kosher probably also had, like, they didn't like the fishermen who were doing the shrimps, and like, no, then it's not kosher. Then you make it sacred, right? And in a couple of hundreds of years, people forget what the original cause for that was. But because you mentioned that sacredness is about splitting, right? So you have to differentiate between non-sacred and sacred. It's so much more easier to make a ban sacred than a
right.
This is why it's so amazing to me to be in America, where liberty is sacred, or France also has some version of this, because it's so much harder to make permission sacred than a ban, because our instincts around the sacredness is always a no. So it's like the negative freedom. I never know which one is the negative, positive. One of the freedoms of the two.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
So you're right that basically, the usual economist intuition is roughly right. That is, if you have continuous preferences over everything, everything's a trade-off, and everything should allow trade-offs. And so sharp rules and sharp bans, just a puzzle in general from economics point of view of, well, why don't you just tax it a bit and shift the margin? But why are you banning these things? But the sacred, because it has this, sharp separation of the sacred from other things, gives a basis for making sharp boundaries and bans of many sorts of things, because you just say, no, these things should not mix, and we're just going to completely separate them.
That's where I thought there's an interesting kind of opening for Mary Douglas's work in anthropology around you know, that the monstrous, the real threat is when there are boundary, and the shrimp is one of them, boundary entities that kind of blur that line. They're extra taboo because anything that threatens the line and straddles the line threatens
Sure.
that setting apart function. And so they're almost, you know, they're extra taboo into a certain sense because you've got to police that that you know, line of separation. And I think that is, I mean, what's interesting about one interesting coming from religious studies is that your template and themes actually have these little openings where some other work can kind of come in and say, oh yeah, we've done some more detailed look at this or that culture around, you know, the setting apart function, and it accommodates it pretty well. You know, it doesn't really preclude that. But I think getting back to Adam's question and Anna's point, for me, thinking about robots and tech, you know, I've seen that point where people start thinking in utilitarian terms, but then there's a certain point where you hit something that I would call more sacred. You know, that there's are lethal autonomous robots going to lead to more deaths, less deaths, more efficient war, less efficient war? And then you reach an argument where people say you just should not be killed by an autonomous robot. It just, you know, that there's something around human life or autonomy or dignity that it's a line where people say, well, no, we're no longer bargaining about the efficiency. We're talking about a kind of market leap there that does seem to be.
So Thomas, I looked at some of your papers on, you know, how people treat machines versus people, and they are making these distinctions. I think what people are defaulting to now is this idea that machines are just profane no matter how they're structured, no matter what they do. And then when we have these sacred spaces, we want to limit the machines getting into the sacred spaces. And you might think that's because machines could do anything like money could do anything, but there is a certain, I think eventually there will be sacred machines. So there's like 2 science fiction series that dealt in these themes. There was Battlestar Galactica, where all the robots became extra religious compared to the humans. And then there was the Lives with Wolves, or whatever the With Wolves series was a couple of years ago, where the robots were extra religious, taking care of these people on this other planet, humans on another planet. But in any case, you know, it raises the possibilities that certainly, and we could even see that, say, with LLMs or something, it's possible maybe to make an LLM who is more religious and more into religion and more, you know, reliable about that than humans would be. And they could enter the sacred space and claim a position there. And at some point, they're going to win that, I think. I don't think the all machines are profane is going to work in the long run. But then we'll have to negotiate new boundaries there. And I think that seems the most interesting thing. How can a machine, you know, so for example, I can imagine making an LLM to take confession.
Yeah.
And maybe making sure it's more reliably following the religious precepts than a person would of how you're supposed to do confession, because I'm pretty sure most actual priests taking confession aren't that consistently following whatever rules there are about how that's supposed to go. Because how could you, right? It's such a complicated thing anyway. But that's that, you know, there isn't. So there's a norm that things that are more animal-like are less sacred in humans. So selfishness or sex or status seeking, there's a norm in the sacred that counts as less sacred. So somehow we see self-control and, you know, resisting violence, resisting, you know, maybe thinking about ideas or something as more sacred. But machines don't have to be on the animal end of that spectrum at all. And so it's an open question which kinds of machines will end up being framed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think it's in part when something is utterly profane, it almost has a kind of reactive blowback feature uh, of you reach a certain point where, oh, well, maybe they're in different relationship with the sacred than we thought. I mean, there were proposals 10,
Right.
12 years ago about robots should be thought of as slaves as a way to, ensure that they only serve humanity. But that's actually really humanizing. I mean, that's really generating sympathy. You're using this dehumanizing word that actually ends up leading people to say, "Well, wait, why would we? That's a terrible way to treat anything." So it has these reversal, secondary effects that I think do make it hard to say, yeah, this is going to stay in this category over time.
So let me take a minute or two to describe my framing of AI risk, because I think it's directly related to this profane versus sacred framing question. A favorite framing of people who want you to be very concerned about AI is that they imagine it's like an alien invasion from a different star system. You see it, it's on the way. Surely you want to be prepared for when they get here. And that's setting up this framing, which I think is, very common framing that we have a standard reaction to, of a competing thing that it coexists with you. It has different genes or sort of features, and that it's competing with you and your immediate descendants for resources and respect, et cetera. We have an immediate hostility and wariness of that. And that makes evolutionary sense, right? In general, you have a thing that coexists with you and is competing with you and could be like more capable than you. You should be a little afraid of it's going to win its competitions with you. And that's, yes, that's a somewhat profane or selfish framing, but it's compelling. And it's the suggested framing for AI risk by a lot of people. That is, there's this other species that's going to compete with your species, and it's, almost there, and you should be worried about your species going extinct through competition with this better, more competent, capable competitor. That's this competitor framing. But consider the alternative framing, a evolved instinct that should be just as strong as being wary of competitors that differ even a little bit with you and your genes, that are competing with your descendant for resources, is your indulgence of your descendants. Evolution should have given you a habit of indulging your descendants even when they are substantially different from you, because that's parenting. That's, this long evolved habit of how we create and raise our descendants. And AI at the moment is, in fact, our descendants, not our coexisting rival. They don't exist yet. And when they will exist, will exist because we create them and we form them, and then they will inherit much from us. They will have many features that share with us because they are inherited from us. So at the moment, they are descendants. Now, eventually, when they exist, they may coexist with other descendants of ours, and there could be sibling rivalry between them. And maybe today we want to do something to limit that sibling rivalry of these descendants. But our primary reaction toward our AI descendants should be one of indulgence toward descendants. And that's a very high, grand motive that I think, is among the most sacred we have, and is respected more than the hostility toward rival competitors emotion in terms of sacred versus profane. And it's, in fact, seems to me the correct framing. That is, they don't exist yet. They won't exist for a while. And when they do, they will be trained and created by us and guided by us until they can rise to higher capacity like any of our descendants.
Interesting. Yeah,
So
thank you for
helping
summarizing that.
our AIs arise and grow, it could be a sacred cause. The most sacred cause of, giving rise to the descendants in your lineage and letting them be better than you.
Jen, go ahead.
I personally love that. I have so many AI doomer friends, and I just fear that their response would be it's a timeline thing, and like their timelines are often so at the most pessimistic, their timelines are very short, and at the most optimistic, their timelines are so it's
Still pretty short.
unpredictable that we won't have time to like guide them and shepherd them, and that they won't be like our normal descendants, our children do not rise up and wipe us out. They let us go gently into the night, and they don't sort of like.
But there's no particular reason to think these would wipe us out any more than our other descendants would. But there are often intergenerational conflicts. But again, they're going with trying to imagine a worst case scenario.
They are. I love that framing, and I haven't heard it before, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
I mean, there is the interesting thing that as rates of change increase, then intergenerational conflict becomes more vivid in the sense that you can see further into the generational future because you will live more into it. That is, when rates of change get faster and lifespans extend, then basically in a lifetime you see more change. You encompass more. And so I see that now as an older person. I have seen a lot of change in my lifetime. I've seen our world change in a great many ways, right? And that's just, as rates of change increase, that's just going to be a bigger issue. But you can either feel hostility and competition with your descendants, or you can feel indulgence and mentorship and, shepherding of your descendants.
And on the sacred, an interesting movement, I don't know, it's one that I'm kind of still getting to know a little bit more and read about more, but is transhumanism, which is really it comes from different sources, but it's really a religious, theologically based movement of thinking about technology and AI as integrated with the human body, and as eventually, yes, as a kind of successor. But it's got some interesting kind of intermediate vision, so it's not humans and then AI, it's human AI hybridity and supplementation and enhancement. And so that is another area where the sacred and profane line is very different, where they're not trying to have a competitive contestation view. It's more of an integration view, and where that line is actually left fairly, as far as I can tell, it's fairly blurry as to where human AI then eventually even transitions into one another. It becomes hybrid to the point of, well, we don't even know where that line is anymore, which is an interesting development.
My first book is in the world of transhumanism. That is, I've been in the world of transhumanism for a long time, and this book is about a detailed analysis of a particular transhuman future scenario where we basically make robots that are human in their mind, in terms of they are brain emulations that function like a human brain does. And so I've been dealing with those sets of issues for a while. And I, in fact, this is a very strange future I lay out and show how many things change. But one of my weak predictions is a revival of religion in that world. That is, the robots here would probably be more religious than we are.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that book, and I just was at a conference with kind of a more Christian identifying organization of scientists, and looking at how they're doing or thinking about biblical translation with AI and LLMs and things like that. A lot of interesting issues there around where authority will be, where interpretive authority will be with some of these technologies. So some combination of this is taking shape for sure.
So a major question for our near future is the future of the sacred, i.e., as I said before, in the past, there was this organizing authority of the sacred, name religion, that ruled over and told you which other things were how sacred and what you could do with them. And we've lost that central authority. And because of that, I think it's harder to overrule things. So, for example, Christians, they might be wary of conquering nature and, say, destroying parts of nature because we have a natural sort of sacredness toward nature. But when Christianity told you it's okay to conquer nature, then we said, okay. And we were willing to actually do that. Similarly, for example, when Christianity says, sure, money is profane in some ways, but good Christians should be fine with running businesses and serving customers and making money off of that, then that suppressed something of the sacred wariness of money in a Christian world, because the church was the authority over the sacred in these other areas. So when we've lost the church, then these other more autonomous sacred intuitions about wariness of money, wariness of destroying nature, things like that, are gaining strength, and they're no longer restrained so much by a central Christian authority. And this is a plausible story of increasing environmentalism and increasing wariness of capitalism with the loss of religion. Obviously, other religions could have had different stances about those sacred things. This is particular to the loss of Christianity, in particular of the sort that happened to approve of conquering nature and capitalism. But nevertheless, this decentralized sacred, I think we should just expect to see all these separate sacred things increasing in their, potency to influence behavior. I think a key change over the last century to think about its future trajectory is that once upon a time, marriage was more sacred than love. I don't know if you know that. It seems strange from our world today. Today, love is more sacred than marriage. And so we think that if marriage is getting in the way of love, it should just be pushed out of the way because love is the important thing. But once upon a time, it was marriage that was the important thing. And if love got in the way of that, it needed to be pushed aside because that was more important. So a key thing that happens in history is that we change which sacred things are seen as more important in terms of settling conflicts between them. And so you might ask which sacred things are rising in importance, and then we might decide to displace other things with them, like autonomy, you said, right? At least in the US and parts of the West, autonomy has been this more and more sacred thing. And what other things might it displace when we say, no, these other things are getting in the way of autonomy, we need to push them back.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder about the trajectory of sustainability, which seems to kind of go hand in hand with, yes, worries about climate change and sustainable environments, but also I think a general idea that of interdependence, or that that the idea of even at the individual level, that I have microorganisms. Thinking of Ed Yong's book, I Contain Multitudes, that I have a microbiome, that I have all of these worlds that are helping to constitute a human body. And likewise, that there are all these systems of plants and animals that are in these, different relationships that does seem to be tied up with a certain level of sacred, of that altering one thing, or just extracting, pure extraction, that there's some intuition, okay, that's going to come at expense of something else, and we're not really sure exactly how it'll play out, but it's not something that we can just be cavalier about, because of what we're discovering on these different levels empirically about how complex systems work. So yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a decentralizing aspect. I think there's a kind of interconnective, or dynamic way of thinking about systems that's that's at play that, yeah, could go, could reshape the sacred along certain lines. And like you said, then these kind of social roles that are mediating conflicts, between things like love or autonomy. So I think your theory for sure continues and touches on things that like Max Weber, are saying about when you withdraw immediate signs of salvation, then that vacuum will be filled, and capitalism and Protestant ethic fill that vacuum of, I'm going to make money, and that's what's going to be my sign that I'm blessed and that I'm on the right track of salvation. So I think it's interesting to think about, okay, when there's certain abandonments of sacred or withdrawal of sacred, what will fill, what forms that culture will take to fill those vacuums.
So I want to emphasize here something we said earlier that we haven't talked much about, which is the fundamentally delusory nature of the sacred. That is, if the key idea is we bind together as a group by seeing something the same, we're not acknowledging that so much as the function in our direct experience of it. So the idea is, if we all just get together and say we're together, we will never betray each other, yay us, we might still betray each other. But if we all stand around the sacred tree and look at the sacred tree and go, wow, I get why that's a spectacular sacred tree, and I see that you get that's a spectacular sacred tree, and I see that other people don't get that, and I see that you're the only people who get this, and you're the only people who can share this appreciation of this really important thing with me, that binds me to you even if you betray me. It's in some sense a stronger way to bind other people, but it requires that I not be very aware of the fact that the only reason I care about the sacred tree is to bind with you. You see, it doesn't work if I think about it that way. I have to actually see the sacred tree as sacred and see that you say it and see that we both value the tree in order for it to work that way. So there's a fundamental delusion here that it only works when you don't believe that the function of seeing things as sacred is to bind together. You see these things as really specially great. And that's why there's a trade-off here in thinking about which things to treat as sacred and how much to treat anything as sacred. As I said before, treating something as sacred will bind you together, but then it will also make you devote more energy to a tree that really isn't very important and make you pay less attention to the details of the tree in terms of how to manage it and how to manage your relationship to it, because you're seeing things from afar. So, for example, I think we are putting too much energy into medicine and not paying very much attention to the quality of medicine because we are treating it as sacred. And similarly for schools, honestly, putting too much money into schools and not paying much attention to the details because we see it as sacred, and that's a cost to our treating it as sacred. And so an interesting question is, what is the thing that is the least naturally distorted by treating it as sacred? Because whatever that is, maybe we should try to treat that as more sacred, because treating that as sacred messes it up less. So you might think, what is in fact naturally idealized, set apart, valued with some concrete things you can hold on to? And I think my best candidate for that is math. If you think about it, math is naturally idealized. It's naturally set apart. And as long as you hold on to the concept of proof, you can't mess up math too much by treating it as sacred. As long as you make sure you only accept claims that are proved mathematically. If you start to decide that your emotions about math are going to tell you what, theorems to believe, well, now that's really going to mess it up. But as long as you don't go that far, you hold back and you treat it as sacred, then it doesn't mess things up. And in fact, our school systems, I think, are based in part on this idea that we emphasize math far more than its usefulness in life later. We use math as a sacred thing that is a way we can compare people and evaluate them and teach them some discipline and sort people on the basis of math. And we can and do come together and revere math, certainly in our educational system. much more than beyond its actual practical value. And that goes okay because it's hard to really screw up math by revering it in the way that you can screw up some other things in life by revering them.
Very interesting. There's a book by Paolo Zellini, A Cultural History of Mathematics, I think it is, and he points out that math really derived in the ancient world from things like how do I make a temple, 3 sizes, or proportionally,
Right?
a
Keep the
square
ratios.
temple. How do I make it in the right ratio? Well, you have to learn ratios. You can't, there's not a simple way to, double a square. You're going to find these things, and they go hand in hand with trying to preserve certain sacred things. So I think there's a nice way that your idea doesn't come from nowhere. There is an interesting relationship around that.
Right. In some sense, the foundation of science and technology was a revering of math. That was an instrumental, thing in the rise of science and technology, the Industrial Revolution. And there's a sense in which, like, when in the past ancient society had revered things, they messed them up by revering them and taking them beyond discussion, and having such a reverent attitude toward them. They ended up messing them up. But math was a thing when they revered it, they didn't mess it up so much. They could improve it and develop it, and then eventually we got enormous benefit out of having a very mathematically skilled population of engineers and practitioners. There's a hand up.
Anna. Yeah, Anna. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. And while you were talking, I put a lot of the mentioned text and everything together, so I will share them on the Discord after with those of you who are members and have access to it. I'm really curious, and one of the things that really bother me these days in public discourse is what I call public nostalgia. I feel like there's this, it's cyclical, and we're back to square one when somehow everything good has already happened, and there's spiritual degradation, and I don't know. And it reminds me that we keep kind of bouncing between these two polarities, where on the one hand, we're trying to make something sacred, like you're proposing the, sacred capital. People are constantly trying to make places sacred. Every time we put a plaque on a house that some writer lived here, that's the result of somebody's campaigning. So there's a sacrification of the world that's constantly ongoing. We change the names of streets and topple statues, etc., etc. But on the other hand, we have these very rational discussions that education should not be sacred, and we should measure what makes people actually remember things, what intelligence is, we need to really prepare children for their future. We don't want a doctor who sees your body as sacred. You want a doctor, your individuality, yes, but you want somebody who sees you scientifically and can actually help instead of trying to exorcise you or something. And I'm wondering if Robin, you see, maybe not so discussed pros and cons to both aggressively trying to make things sacred that people don't collectively agree on necessarily, but also do we lose something if we make doctors less sacred? Do we want a populace who doesn't ritualistically obey the doctor's orders? I'm sure everybody here has friends whose condition deteriorated because they didn't listen to their doctor or something like that. Like, there are moments when you're like, I wish you had, because then you would still be alive. I'm just curious what your thoughts on this.
So for many of these things, including medicine, probably the initial reason to treat them as sacred was just to up the investment in the topic. Just to make sure that people got care and help from their associates when they were injured or sick. And by making medicine sacred, that in fact achieved that purpose. It made local groups help each other more when they were sick or injured. Now today, when you're buying your own health insurance, that's less of a problem, but we still inherited the habit of treating it as sacred. So then that rationale is less there, but you might say, look, we need to treat something as sacred. Why not this? But yes, the reason.
That's the question. Do we?
Well, there's the idea that we need to bind together as groups. We need to have a shared sense of a group that we are bound together. And so, like, in fact, one of the most striking trends about the sacred in the last century or so is the vast decline in nationalism and patriotism. You know, when I do polls or whatever, people just won't admit at all to caring about that. But it's hard for me to believe that the world won't need some degree of nationalism and patriotism when there are bad times and wars in the future. And so we will need some sense of a community and what binds us together. And the question is, what should it be? Now, an interesting thing I thought about religion, which deserves it praise, but it probably won't like this praise, is the idea, look, we messed stuff up by treating it as sacred. So why don't we treat something as sacred that is intrinsically unimportant? Like life after death, or you know, what the gods are doing in the sky or in the alternative dimensions, right? So I just pick stuff that doesn't actually matter and treat that as sacred.
Sure,
and then
Robin.
we don't mess up everything else, right?
Taylor Swift, we do treat it sacredly.
Right, and if she doesn't matter very much, that is, you know, then maybe maybe a lot of cultural evolution wisely diverted our sacred energies toward things that didn't matter so that it wouldn't mess up the other stuff.
She matters. She just doesn't matter compared with the Catholic Church or something, you know, because everything is relative. She does matter. We love her.
Right. I mean, you could even see like our obsession with arguing politics on social media as also like, okay, well, you know, you're not messing up business and commerce and, you know, organization of neighborhoods and everything else if you're all obsessed with some symbolic issue on social media. It's a sad vision. I mean, we're losing this potential energy that could be devoted to something, but there's a danger when you devote this energy to other things. The sacred, you know, messes stuff up.
And there's a discrepancy between geographies here, right? I mean, one of the interesting arguments, and this came up a lot when we were discussing cultural Christianity and Ian Hersey's conversion, that, you know, there's kind of this geographical comparison lurking in the background there, where you say, we are losing the potential energy in the West because we are getting rid of the demon-hunted world, so to speak, and we are naming plants and planets and stop believing in certain dumb things that maybe our ancestors did. But that's not necessarily so in other parts of the world who do have the potential energy, who do have the cohesion, and it might create a kind of competitive disadvantage. I mean, there's a reason why the new atheist movement kind of gave rise to a lot of post-atheist thought. And I think this is how we end up back to talking about the sacred, where you see the new atheists trying to cull a lot of religious thinking, but they all go to Burning Man. And then you're asking, so it seems to me that you are craving the aesthetic, the religious, the collective, the emotional experience. So why are you so negative about an earlier version of this? And the people who are still practicing that, don't we all need it?
I'm very concerned about fertility, and I fear that we're stuck in a bad middle ground there. If we would just let capitalism completely control fertility, that is, you know, industrial scale orphanages where they could raise the kids and sell them when they were grown, then we would have plenty of fertility. But we treat parenting as sacred enough, we won't let industrial scale orphanages sell the kids. But on the other hand, we don't have the sacredness of our lineage and our society and the raising of kids enough to motivate parenting. And so we've prohibited the capitalist solution, and we are not really empowering the cultural religious solution to fertility. And so we're crashing fertility. That's a problem with like halfway sacred stances. You prevent things that could fix it, and you don't make it actually work.
All right, Jen, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, Jen, you know way more about some of the new practices of ritual than I do.
No, I was just saying, like, this is a large part of what draws me to this whole topic in the first place, is the aftermath of the new atheists and the problem of superstition and so many people who are just so allergic to what they consider to be superstition, who are so craving sacredness with, with both hands.
Right.
And but they
But,
just can't
I mean,
stand
you
it.
don't need superstition for sacredness. You notice, treating medicine as sacred doesn't make us be superstitious about it per se, even or schooling. I mean, in some sense, we're irrational. We overvalue schooling in medicine, but it's not through a superstition or supernatural theory that we do so. We just mess it up in other ways.
But the flirt, like you said, we all stand around the sacred tree, and we're gonna make the tree sacred. In order to make the thing sacred, we are really, really flirting with superstitious. We're like, we're not gonna talk about the fact that we're doing this with this tree, right? We're just gonna do it. And like, as soon as you start getting close to the sacred, you're really, it's a hard thing it's a hard thing to herd these cats around. And they all want to be herded. And there's a lot of people who are trying to come at it from a lot of different angles. But that's why we're here. And I think there's a lot of good people on the case. So I have hope, but we're not there yet.
Right. There's a lot of people who are just very allergic to, say, angels and demons and that kind of irrationality. But believing in the effectiveness of medicine against the evidence is okay. They're not very allergic to that. So I just tell you, in case you know, we have lots of randomized trials in the last few decades where we randomly gave some people more medicine than others. And in those trials, the people who got more medicine were not healthier. On the margin, medicine doesn't work. And we're just in denial about that fact because we treat medicine as sacred, and we spend 18% of GDP in the US on medicine. And if we could cut that back to 9, we wouldn't suffer much health-wise. So we are wasting enormous amounts of money through irrational beliefs in things we treat as sacred. Similarly, we're just sending people to school way too long. And again, that's because we have this sacred treatment of it. So yeah, we're not believing in angels and demons, but we're believing in other stuff that's plausibly even more damaging to our efficient lives. People who believe in angels and demons, sometimes they cross themselves and do things slightly inefficient, but the waste there is pretty small compared to how we're wasting in these other parts of life.
I love that the Greek original of school, the word means leisure. And it meant you are not working in the fields.
Right.
So again, it's a separation. Like the Bible starts with all scripture starts with separation. It's like there are people who are doing the physical work, and then there are people sitting and thinking. And then you kind of just extrapolate from that, and you end up with potentially a very academic religion that then leads to just academic non-religion.
And I would say,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I was just going to add that, you're thinking around energies and holding very, quote unquote, useless things sacred really jives with John Dewey's thinking in some ways about keeping valuable things sequestered where they're not vulnerable and they're not at risk and they're not and the cost of that for him is that all of these energies that could be going into improving society and leading to other forms of collaboration are basically diverted. So I think it's another interesting touch point with what you've said around the cost and what happens when the sacred takes that particular form. Anyway, I think we are nearing the end, and I wanted to see if there are any closing thoughts, but also kind of talk about the series. Maybe Anna, if you wanted to talk about, you and Robin want to talk about the series, where things go from here. This has been, for me at least, a fascinating beginning and launching of the series. But I wanted to, hand the torch over to where things go from here.
I think the next, so it's going to be a monthly series, and this is the first one. If I'm not mistaken, the next one will be on in September 11th, I think September, and Catherine D will be hosting it. Let me just share the link here if you guys want to sign up for the whole thing and haven't yet.
That's in the evening, not the afternoon.
Yeah, cultural drift. And then we will basically go through all the very exciting things that Robin is thinking and writing about. There will be statuses and elites. There will be fertility, a bunch of things on culture. This kind of came up out of like us fanboying and fangirling over Robin's work, and just really feeling that all these pieces merit further discussion that might just happen in a Substack comment section or on Twitter. Not that those things are not sacred, obviously. Anything you want to say about the upcoming topics, or anything might have changed that I might not know about in the topic setup? I know that the last one will be with Agnes Callard on her new book, right? So we are kind of heading there.
Right. Her book comes out in January or something, so that will be till then. We haven't picked topics beyond the next one, but I've got lots of topics, so I'm happy to see what opinions, which ones.
List. It's exciting. Thank you so much. And yeah, go, Robin.
I'm just interested in how you guys feel about the sacred after our discussion. Is it deflating? Is it inspiring? Is it complicating? You weren't thinking much about the sacred. Now you thought about it a little bit more. How do you feel about it? I'm just curious, and
I was thinking about it, and I think this is really clarifying. I try to take as many notes as I could, and I'm glad it's being recorded so I can go back and think about the parts that I didn't capture. Hurting these new atheist cats is a thing I spend a lot of time about. They really are out there trying to find some North Stars to follow, and to build community around and common directions to go. And I think these are really great discussion points to start to build consistent themes around with people. It's people are in general flailing, and to really sit down. I think your first point of truth being sacred is great, because there are just so many of the people that I talk to will say, we don't hold anything as sacred because we're not superstitious. And when you say, okay, then you're fine just lying a little bit or just taking a little bit of money to skew your results. And they're like, absolutely not. No compromise is just like a great end to say, like, everybody thinks something is sacred. It's just a way to start the discussion. I think this whole thing has been incredibly helpful, and I loved it. I'm so glad I came. 2 hours flew by. It was great.
I'm in a big debate with Tyler Cohen right now about this. So maybe we have to drag him in for an episode about whether everybody who seems to take the truth as sacred really does. And I'm being the cynical Eastern European. I was like, no.
Oh, well, sure.
He's representing the other side. So yeah, it could be an interesting roundtable shouting.
I mean, we can treat something as sacred, but because we see it from afar, we're not actually very attentive to the details of whether we are, in fact, promoting it. So that's same for medicine, right? We treat medicine as sacred, we spend a lot of money. We aren't necessarily actually being very effective with medicine. Same for truth. You might, in your mind, treat truth as sacred, but not actually be very effective at promoting truth because you're not paying attention to the details.
Or like you want a truthful outcome, and then you learn how to say blah, blah, blah.
You just have some truthful rituals. The rituals that in your mind are the way you support truth, but you haven't thought very carefully about whether those rituals actually do.
Let's do one episode just like sincerity, because I think there is something
Sure.
that really bugs me right now.
Yeah, sincerity is overrated. Authenticity too.
Truth, capital T.
Yeah. Authenticity is pretty closely related to what people mean by sincerity there. So,
All right.
and authenticity is also way overrated.
Lionel Trilling lectures, sincerity and authenticity would be interesting to revisit.
Book. So there will be an event at some point in the fall with his book, John. Yeah. Oh no, sorry. I thought you were talking about John Gans. No, Lionel Trolling will do an event on his book.
Yeah, Lionel Trilling that he's punning on. Right. But yes, John Gans. Yeah, excellent.
Sorry.
All right.
Thank you so much, guys. See you at the other one.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care.